The tension accumulated in the air was even thicker than a Georgia summer's heat. This was the National Law Enforcement Academy Security Control Gate. An architectural structure of stone and steel, a symbol of the ultimate authority of the law. Behind it was a world of discipline, authority, and professionalism. Before it, for men like Officer Ryan McAllister, was an invisible barrier used to screen out the types of people he believed were unworthy of entry. An old gray sedan, hundreds of thousands of miles on the clock, slowly rolled to the inspection area. It was not a luxury car, nor the armored black SUV often seen here. Inside was Senior Agent Angela Brooks. She wore a simple outfit, bore no identification signs, only a heavy steel watch on her wrist. Brooks was a woman of color, possessing a calm demeanor. Eyes sharp as a dagger and her hair neatly pinned up. Her appearance did not match any of the prejudices McAllister typically used to categorize others. But for McAllister, a person of color and a cheap car at a federal facility were already damning evidence. Officer Ryan McAllister stood ready, leaning against the marble control booth. He was a large white man with a short-cropped haircut, cold blue eyes, and a self-satisfied attitude honed by 22 years of service at the same gate, where no one had ever dared to challenge his authority. His shining badge, number 612, seemed to be his impenetrable armor. He did not move, only gestured for Brooks to stop. He was ready for a confrontation he was sure to win. Brooks turned off the engine and lowered the window. She felt McAllister's naked, disdainful gaze sweeping over her from the top of her head to her car. McAllister's voice boomed, carrying mockery and crudeness amplified by an attitude he called professionalism, but which was in fact undisguised racism. He did not ask for identification. He delivered a verdict. "Frankly, bitch, this area ain't for your kind of low-class people. Now move along." McAllister stepped closer, bending down to the window, his breath smelling of cheap coffee and power. "You hear me? Get lost. The soup kitchen is the other way." McAllister cleared his throat, turning to look at his colleague in the cabin, who was smiling awkwardly. He enjoyed this moment, the public humiliation. It reinforced his belief that he was the guardian of order, the classifier of intruders. Brooks did not move. There was no visible emotion on her face. She maintained her seated posture like a statue carved from restraint. Only her breathing became slower, deeper. Her silence to McAllister was a challenge. "I said, are you deaf?" McAllister pressed, banging his hand heavily on the car door. "This is the National Law Enforcement Academy. You have no business here." "Did you hear me, little girl?" Brooks finally spoke, her voice low and clear, cutting through McAllister's arrogance like a laser. "Officer, I am here by arrangement. I have paperwork." Brooks slowly pulled a thin plastic card from the document holder. It was a special access card bearing her photo name and rank, but all were obscured beneath security layers. Most importantly, the large, sharp seal, Federal Access. McAllister snatched the card without looking at it. He flipped it over. Sneering, "Arrangement, crappy fake paperwork. You people always think a plastic card with a sticker is enough to get through here." His voice dropped, full of contempt. "Funny, where will this take you? Jail?" And then the unforgivable act occurred. With a decisive, powerful force, McAllister ripped the plastic card into 2 pieces and then into 4 smaller fragments. The fragments of the Federal Access seal scattered. He threw them onto the concrete ground. The peak of humiliation, McAllister spat right onto the shredded pieces of the card, right in front of Brooks. "Now get lost before I decide to apply the digital interrogation procedure right to your face." Brooks looked down at the ruined card fragments on the ground where McAllister's spit was spreading. She did not look at McAllister, she looked at his brutality. Her eyes were not angry but calculatingly cold. Officer Ryan McAllister had not just broken the law, he had violated every ethical rule. This was not just an incident, this was undeniable evidence of a pattern. Instead of leaving, Brooks opened her car door. This action to McAllister was active resistance. He had been waiting for it. Brooks stepped out, frighteningly composed. She looked down at the ground and slowly began to collect the shredded card fragments, an act of reclaiming minimal dignity. That was when McAllister decided to end the show. "What the hell are you doing?" McAllister hissed, lunging forward. He grabbed Brooks's arm. Resisting arrest, McAllister shoved Brooks forward. As Brooks lost her balance, McAllister employed the strength of his 22 years of power abuse. He tightly clamped his arm around Brooks's neck, then forcefully pressed his knee into her back, forcing her to fall face down onto the hot concrete right next to the spit-stained card pieces. "Crappy fake paperwork," he gasped, his body weight crushing Brooks's chest. "You are under arrest for federal trespass. I warned you, you bitch." Brooks could feel the weight of authority, of arrogance, and of the concrete pressing into her ribs. She could easily have fought back, her training allowed it, but she knew this was a precious moment. She was not fighting to escape, she was fighting to collect evidence. She did not resist completely submitting, her breath was suppressed. Brooks heard the cold sound of metal. McAllister swiftly locked handcuffs onto her wrists, tightening them until the metal bit deep into her skin. McAllister rolled Brooks over. She lay on the ground, handcuffed behind her back, her breath heavy. McAllister had already reached up to tap his body cam on before he laid his hands on her, ensuring the entire encounter was recorded. Now he chuckled victoriously and pulled out his phone. Recording, McAllister said into the body cam, his voice full of self-satisfaction. "Subject, assaulted me, attempted trespass, neutralized." McAllister bent down, his face inches from Brooks's. He savored her humiliation, but Brooks did not bow her head. She looked straight into McAllister's body cam lens, past his face distorted by arrogance. Her eyes, now stripped of all restraint, held the sharp, absolute conviction of a prosecutor. "Officer Ryan McAllister," her voice was hoarse but clear. Each word spoken like a steel bullet. "I guarantee you will never forget this day." That was not a threat. It was a declaration of destiny. McAllister burst out laughing, a jeering, mocking sound. "Oh, I am terrified. Get her to the holding cell where her kind belongs." Brooks was led away without further resistance, leaving the shredded card fragments and the streak of spit on the hot concrete. 6 hours later, she was released without charge. Without apology, only with deep red marks on her wrists and a large bruise on her back. She was given a standard liability waiver signed by the head of security, requiring her to admit she had violated federal boundary limits and agreed not to pursue civil charges for immediate release. She scanned it, smiled discreetly, and signed. This waiver would become evidence that the facility had attempted to cover up for McAllister. Brooks walked out of the gate, her calculation beginning. 6 hours of unlawful detention, perjury, falsifying evidence, abuse of authority, and now undeniable proof of a systemic cover-up by the facility's administration. 3 weeks later, the federal hearing room was packed. The internal investigation framed as a civil suit Brooks v. McAllister began. Officer Ryan McAllister strode confidently into the room, believing the system that had protected him for 22 years would continue to shield him and that the liability waiver would be his armor. He did not know that the woman he had slapped, spat on, and handcuffed had meticulously planned the downfall of not just his career, but the entire system of cover-up that had tolerated him for 2 decades. It was all part of the plan. The game begins. The National Law Enforcement Academy's internal hearing room lacked the grandeur of a federal courthouse, but the atmosphere was still heavy and decisive. The investigation board members, consisting of 3 hard-faced senior officers and a legal counsel, sat behind an oak table. They were here not to seek justice, but to maintain the system. Officer Ryan McAllister entered no longer the arrogant guard at the gate. He was now a witness in a perfectly pressed uniform, gleaming lapels, a symbol of 22 years of dedicated service. McAllister showed no sign of remorse or anxiety. On the contrary, self-satisfaction emanated from him like an invisible cloak. He was certain that the event 3 weeks prior was just a minor incident, a slight administrative hassle he had handled professionally, like hundreds of times before. His lawyer, a man in an expensive suit named Gregory Nolan, leaned down and whispered a brief phrase, almost a curse. They always believed the police. McAllister smiled lightly. He knew it was true. In 22 years, he had learned how to navigate and manipulate the truth, how to turn acts of abuse into unfortunate procedural errors, and how to transform racism into professional threat assessment. He had steered the law into a personal tool to protect his arrogance. He looked toward Angela Brooks, who was sitting at the opposing table with a temporarily assigned public defender, and he chuckled inwardly. A woman of color, plainly dressed, arrested at the National Law Enforcement Academy. The story told itself. McAllister sat down, straightened his back, and looked directly at the presiding officer. He was ready to spin his violence into heroism. Officer McAllister, the legal counsel, began. Please describe what happened on September 21st at the security control gate. McAllister's voice rang out steady without a trace of tremor. It was trained to persuade, to suppress any doubt. At approximately 8:30 a.m., I was performing my duty to secure this federal facility. I observed an individual whom I now identify as Miss Brooks approaching the checkpoint. He paused, cleared his throat, trying to create a dramatic effect. From the outset, her behavior was suspicious. She failed to comply with basic approach speed rules, and when I signaled her to stop, she displayed clear defiance that immediately put me on high alert. McAllister did not mention the insults. He did not mention the old car. He only spoke about behavior. I requested her to present valid identification. Instead of complying, she attempted to bypass security procedures by offering what appeared to be a counterfeit card. And when I attempted to verify its authenticity, she became hostile. McAllister turned toward the investigation board, spreading his hands. Sirs and madams, in 22 years, I have seen every deception trick. I have seen every type of fake document. My professional judgment was that this subject had no legitimate business here and was attempting to trespass by deception. Brooks sat silently at the opposing table, her lawyer taking frantic notes. Brooks was taking no notes. She merely observed, memorizing every cadence of McAllister's lie. McAllister delved into the details of the violence, now spun as an act of heroic self-defense. When I informed her the card would be seized for further examination, Miss Brooks escalated the situation. She began aggressively advancing toward the control area, a behavior that in a high-security situation like this academy is considered a direct threat. McAllister used precise training language. I issued a clear verbal warning. Step back or I will be forced to neutralize the threat. She ignored my command and continued to advance. I firmly believed she was seeking to assault me or rush past the checkpoint into the academy where hundreds of unprotected trainees and staff were present. McAllister's voice became tense, filled with false drama. In a split second, I had to make a decision to protect myself in the federal facility. I was forced to use standard threat neutralization techniques. He described the knee press and handcuffing as a procedure. I used the minimum body weight necessary to place the subject in a prone position and perform the handcuffing for control. Every action was taken for the purpose of ensuring public safety, not to inflict personal harm on her. Gregory Nolan nodded in agreement. Officer McAllister, can you confirm that all your actions were within the Academy's minimum defensive training protocol? Absolutely correct. Everything was within the guidelines of the Threat Assessment Department. McAllister replied, looking squarely at the investigation board with a grave expression. To cement his innocence, McAllister needed to build his personal record. Officer McAllister, the legal counsel asked, in your 22 years of service at this academy, have you ever been accused of inappropriate conduct or discrimination? McAllister took a deep breath, his lips tight, feigning mild offense. Sirs and madams, never. My record is spotless. I have received countless commendations for my dedication to training new recruits on security and rules of conduct. He paused, looking directly at the investigation board members, many of whom had known him for a long time. I pride myself on maintaining high standards at this academy. I have taught hundreds of trainees the importance of respect, and I have guarded this gate from genuine threats for 2 decades. Furthermore, McAllister continued, his voice echoing in the room, I have given 22 years of my life in service. What happened that day was a textbook example of proper security protocol. A suspicious subject attempted to violate protocol, and I responded professionally, swiftly, and effectively. I refused to apologize for doing my job. McAllister turned back, glancing at Brooks. Contempt was evident on his face. He had spun racism into patriotism, violence into self-defense. He concluded his testimony believing he had won. The system would side with him, it always did. He did not know that his spotless record story was the noose that Angela Brooks had patiently braided to tighten around him. Officer Ryan McAllister's self-satisfaction seemed to fill the hearing room space, but he knew that one testimony was not enough. He needed to solidify his narrative by completely destroying Angela Brooks's credibility. Counsel Nolan. The legal counsel signaled, please proceed. Nolan stood up, adjusted his tie, and addressed McAllister. Officer McAllister, you mentioned Miss Brooks used what appeared to be counterfeit documentation. Could you elaborate on the suspicious nature of these documents? McAllister nodded, his face showing the unwavering resolve of a security expert. Sirs and madams, in 22 years I have seen hundreds of IDs and access cards. The special access card Miss Brooks presented was poorly counterfeited. He paused, waiting for his statement to sink into the minds of the investigation board. I'm not talking about a printing error. I am talking about a clear lack of professionalism in the security design. Faint electronic signature peeling protective overlay. I recognized it immediately. In my experience, people carrying such seemingly counterfeit documents at a high-level federal facility usually have only one single purpose. Nolan prompted, and what is that purpose, officer? That purpose is unauthorized entry, McAllister emphasized, glancing over at Angela Brooks, who remained silently seated, maintaining an unsettling composure. She fits the profile perfectly for smugglers, drug brokers, or low-level scammers looking to access the academy to meet with trainees or senior staff for profit. This is a classic security issue we are trained to identify. McAllister turned back to face the investigation board, his voice containing false urgency. The threat was not in who she was, but in what she was trying to do, conceal her identity and deceive a law enforcement officer at a critical checkpoint. When I confronted her with the truth, she responded with aggression. This is not the behavior of a law-abiding citizen. The naked contempt in McAllister's tone as he described Brooks as a low-level scammer made the air in the room turn cold. He was not just defending himself, he was launching an assault on her dignity and identity. After destroying Brooks's honor, McAllister moved on to attack the motive of the lawsuit, spinning himself as a victim of social tensions. Officer McAllister, Nolan said sympathetically, this lawsuit has impacted your 22-year reputation. Do you believe there are any other motives behind these accusations besides seeking justice? McAllister bowed his head, his voice becoming low and feigning distress. a superb performance of manufactured vulnerability. I believe this lawsuit is nothing more than a blatant attempt to capitalize on ongoing social tensions, McAllister said, emphasizing every word. Miss Brooks is trying to turn a routine security incident, an incident she brought upon herself by non-compliance and using false documents, into a case of racial discrimination. He turned to the investigation board, pleading for sympathy from his colleagues. We who wear the uniform are operating in an almost impossible environment. Every decision, every action is scrutinized, and people like Miss Brooks are ready to exploit that. They break the law, and when caught, they immediately raise the flag of discrimination to evade responsibility. McAllister shook his head with feigned disappointment. This does not just harm me, it harms the integrity of the system. It undermines the real struggles of people who face prejudice. It is an insult to the officers who risk their lives. I have protected this facility for 22 years, and now I am the victim of an attempt to profit from false accusations of racism. Accusations of racism. It was a classic argument of the abuser attack the victim's integrity by blaming the social environment. He had transformed himself into the defender of justice, and Brooks into the one undermining it. Now was the time to solidify the lie with falsified evidence. Sirs and madams, Nolan announced, standing straight to substantiate Officer McAllister's testimony. We will now present the body cam video extracted from his device. A large screen lit up. The video began. The footage was deliberately edited. It started after the moment McAllister had slapped and spat, and after he had pressed his knee into Brooks's back. The video showed Brooks attempting to rise her body, staggering and clearly in pain. In this manufactured version, she appeared resistant and aggressive as she tried to pull her hands away from McAllister to stand upright. The original audio, including McAllister's racist slurs, had been completely excised and replaced with the white noise of the academy. The video concluded with McAllister looking calm and professional, tightening handcuffs on Brooks's wrists and his voice saying, "You are under arrest for federal trespass." Nolan stepped closer to the screen. Sirs and madams, this footage clearly shows the plaintiff aggressively advancing after being asked for identification. It also shows the measured and appropriate response of Officer McAllister, who used minimum force to neutralize the threat. He turned to look at Brooks now, an opponent he believed to be defeated. This record reflects the truth, not the emotional claims of someone seeking a financial windfall. Both McAllister and Nolan smirked. This manufactured evidence was the final wall protecting them. They believed that no evidence could penetrate this manipulation. To complete the picture of systemic cover-up, colleagues were needed to defend McAllister. Two senior officers long serving at the academy, named Lieutenant Mark Ellis and Sergeant Carlos Vega, were called to the stand in turn. Both were former colleagues and had covered for McAllister in the past. Lieutenant Ellis, a middle-aged man with a tired but resolute look, began. I have worked with McAllister for 17 years. He is the most professional man I know. He is a brother, a mentor. He treats everyone fairly, regardless of race or background. He taught me a lot about maintaining security. He is a valuable asset to the academy. Sergeant Vega was more eloquent. McAllister is a great mentor for new recruits. He teaches them the importance of respecting the law. I have never witnessed any inappropriate conduct from him. He is a stand-up guy, and he is the first one to help a colleague. Vega even looked directly at Brooks, who still sat silently, and said, I believe these accusations are false. McAllister is the one who taught us about integrity. As the two witnesses left the stand, McAllister turned to look at Brooks. His gaze contained ultimate arrogance. It said, See, I am not a person. I am a system, and this system cannot be defeated. McAllister felt satisfied. He had turned the victim into the aggressor, violence into defense, and racism into social responsibility. He had presented false evidence supported by false testimony. Now was the time to await Brooks's collapse. He did not know that Angela Brooks's sharp eyes had recorded every lie, every breath, and every detail of the organized cover-up he had just exposed. She had enough. The truth was waiting for the 3:00 p.m. moment. Officer Ryan McAllister concluded his false testimony with a winning smile, believing he had completely controlled the narrative, but the moment Angela Brooks stood up, the atmosphere in the hearing room changed. She did not require the temporarily assigned public defender to accompany her. She declined that protection. She announced she would represent herself. Plaintiff Miss Brooks, the legal counsel, spoke, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. "Please take the stand." Brooks walked slowly, deliberately. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit without a wrinkle, exuding the appearance of someone who not only understood the rules but wrote them. She carried a high-end leather briefcase meticulously organized, containing not a few loose papers, but color-coded file folders. Her entire demeanor, from the heavy steel watch on her wrist to her sharp gaze, radiated a quiet authority. McAllister, sitting at the defendant's table, felt a vague discomfort. She should have been trembling, confused, angry. She should have been an easily manipulated victim. But this woman walked as if she was about to deliver a lecture at a law school, not a hearing about her own humiliation. "Please state your full name for the record," the legal counsel requested. Angela Denise Brooks. Her voice was low, clear, resonating in the room, not raised but allowing no interruption. "Miss Brooks, please recount what happened on September 21st at the National Law Enforcement Academy gate." Brooks began her testimony. It was not a complaint, not an emotional story. It was an orally narrated operational incident report. "I approached the security checkpoint at 8:30 a.m. I complied with the speed limit and stopped at the designated line. Officer McAllister approached my vehicle and immediately, without verifying identity, issued racist insults." Brooks did not repeat McAllister's crude slurs. She only described the abusive behavior in cold legal language. The officer made deeply prejudicial remarks regarding my identity and purpose at this federal facility. She detailed the presentation of her special access card and McAllister's act of ripping it up. I bent down to collect the shredded card pieces. This was an act of non-resistance, non-aggression, but an act to ensure my physical evidence was not completely disposed of. And what was Officer McAllister's reaction to this action? Officer McAllister physically assaulted me. He forcefully pressed his knee into my back and used the handcuffs brutally. This action was taken while I was in full compliance, showing no signs of resistance or threat. Brooks emphasized the contrast between her calmness and McAllister's unprovoked violence. Every word of hers was precise, without excess. She did not need to cry. The truth presented concisely and professionally held more weight than any emotion. McAllister's lawyer, Nolan, stood up. "Sirs and madams, the plaintiff is describing defensive restraint as assault. She has no medical evidence of serious injury." Brooks turned to Nolan, her gaze unforgiving. She did not need a legal counsel. She was her own legal counsel. "Counselor, please refer to Exhibit 12-01 medical records," Brooks said, pointing to her leather briefcase. "I do have medical evidence." She pulled out a separate file. "I submit the following evidence." She passed the photos and records to the investigation board. The board members, who had been skeptical, suddenly sat upright. This medical record was not from some private clinic. It was federal medical documentation carrying the highest legal weight. The photos clearly showed a large, deep bruise on her lower back, caused by forceful knee press, and even more clearly, deep red and bruised marks around her wrist, due to overly tightened handcuffs, completely matching her testimony. The specialist confirmed the injuries are fully consistent with a strong knee press and excessive use of handcuffs with no signs of struggle or resistance from my side, Brooks asserted, her voice ringing out amidst the silence. The investigation board's legal counsel looked at McAllister with a cold expression. McAllister's false testimony had just been shattered by federal medical documentation. Nolan, attempting to salvage the situation, began cross-examination. He tried to force Brooks to admit she had resisted or violated security rules. "Miss Brooks, do you have any proof that you had legitimate business at the academy? Were you not just an ordinary citizen trying to cause trouble?" Nolan asked aggressively. Counselor Brooks replied, her voice not angry but with the patience of a professor for a slow student. "I did have legitimate business. As for whether I am an ordinary citizen, that is irrelevant. Every citizen, regardless of rank or position, has the right to be treated with respect and without violence." Nolan was flustered. "So what was your purpose in collecting the shredded card pieces? Were you trying to stall to provoke Officer McAllister?" "Counselor, that question is assuming facts, not in evidence. My purpose was to preserve the material evidence of Officer McAllister's procedural violation." Brooks began her counterattack. When Nolan posed a compound question, Brooks immediately interrupted. "Objection, counsel. The lawyer is asking a compound question violating Federal Rules of Procedure, Rule 601. Nolan gaped. This was not the behavior of an ordinary plaintiff. She did not just know the law. She had memorized the Federal Rules of Procedure. Brooks's cross-examination was not to prove her innocence, but to gradually reveal her authority. Nolan, now sweating, tried to pivot. "Miss Brooks, you stated you were very familiar with the Academy's recruitment and complaint records. Where do you gain this experience? From reading the newspaper?" A small, almost imperceptible smile appeared on Brooks's lips. Counselor Brooks said, looking directly at McAllister, who sat rigidly, "I have extensive experience in building and overseeing the FBI internal affairs protocols and federal police accountability measures." The entire hearing room fell silent. FBI. McAllister looked at his lawyer with a panicked expression. "More specifically, I spent 7 years at the Department of Justice's Criminal Justice Division, working directly on cases of police abusive power. I am not merely familiar with the Academy's records. I wrote many of the procedures this Academy is currently violating." Brooks turned toward the investigation board. "I can clarify that my familiarity with Officer McAllister's record did not come from reading the newspaper. It came from my study of his pattern of misconduct within the framework of my work as a federal official." Nolan, having nothing left to lose, attempted a final attack on motive money. "Miss Brooks, if you are truly a high-ranking federal official, why are you involved in a civil lawsuit seeking personal financial gain?" Brooks smiled wider, a smile indicating imminent victory. "Counselor, my motive is not money. My motive is justice, accountability, and systemic policy change." "So you are seeking compensation?" "Yes," Brooks replied definitively, "but any awarded compensation will be transferred directly and entirely into the National Police Trainee Conduct Initiative. That money will be used to establish mandatory training programs on psychological evaluation and unconscious bias at this academy and other facilities. I am not seeking personal gain." Counselor Brooks concluded, her voice holding unwavering resolve. "I am seeking to ensure that what Officer McAllister did to me never happens to anyone else." By this point, McAllister had completely collapsed. He knew he had lost, but he did not know by how much. Brooks checked the steel watch on her wrist. The hands pointed to 2:45 p.m. She had an eager, almost excited look in her eyes. Counsel Brooks said, turning to the investigation board, "I believe we need a recess now." The legal counsel frowned. "Plaintiff, we are in the middle of a hearing. Do you have a specific reason? Yes, Brooks replied with absolute declaration. I have an important virtual meeting at 3:00 p.m. with the National Oversight Council. This meeting will clarify and provide the supreme legal and administrative context for this entire lawsuit. The clock was counting down to 3:00 p.m., end of temporary hearing session. A self-satisfied McAllister withdraws. The story pulls back, lifting the secret curtain on Brooks's true identity. It was the night before the hearing, and Angela Brooks's home office was not like a normal workspace. It was the command center of a 20-year war. The desk lamp shone down, highlighting the symbols of a life built on confidence and integrity. There were no romantic personal decorations. Instead, the walls were covered with badges of authority. Boston College Law School graduation diploma, luxuriously framed senior FBI agent card prominently displayed in a glass case, medal for distinguished service. Placed right next to a photo of her in National Law Enforcement Academy uniform. She had once been the top trainee of the very academy McAllister was guarding. Brooks sat before her computer, not with the attitude of a victim anxious about a lawsuit, but with the composure of a legal architect reviewing blueprints for a calculated collapse. She did not need to hire expensive lawyers. She was one of the Department of Justice's sharpest counsels, sent on a mission known to no one. In front of Brooks was a thick dossier torn at the corners from intensive study. The title sticker on the cover read, McAllister Ryan Personnel Review. A pattern Brooks mumbled, her voice echoing in the silent room. A pattern of abusive power that was ignored. The file contained 21 complaints of misconduct, spanning McAllister's 17 years of service. 14 of them had been dismissed without proper investigation, buried under the Academy administration's procedural loopholes and walls of slants. Brooks scanned the cases. A lawyer of color asked for random checks 3 times a week, an Asian American engineering student detained for looking too smart to be a good person. An African American veteran humiliated because of his old bicycle. McAllister built a small empire of arrogance at that gate, Brooks whispered, tapping a finger on an old internal email from McAllister's superior. As long as the gate is clean, let Ryan do it his way. The attack on her was not random, but the inevitable culmination of a system that had tolerated this abuse of power for decades. The light on the laptop screen flickered. A video call came in from the divisional FBI director, a respectable white man named Director Thomas Whitaker. Angela, everything is ready for the virtual swearing-in ceremony tomorrow. Director Whitaker said, his face grave. The entire National Oversight Council will attend. The time is 3:00 p.m. immediately after McAllister's hearing concludes. Excellent, Director, Brooks replied. I have ensured the Internal Investigation Board will be forced into a recess right on time. The revelation needs to happen in front of them, direct and undeniable, so they understand the consequences of their cover-up. Director Whitaker nodded. Your position as chief of the National Recruitment and Training Review Board is a pivotal role, Angela. It grants you direct authority over all personnel policy and conduct at the Academy. That power is supreme. That is why I needed this attack to happen, Brooks explained. I needed McAllister to believe I was a low-level intruder so he would dig deep into his lies. His abuse of power and use of false evidence in court strengthens our case for systemic failure at the Academy. I am not suing an officer. I am suing a culture that allowed an officer like him to exist. Brooks's private phone rang. It was a call from Chief Walter Briggs, her former mentor, a retired senior agent. Today is the day, Angela, Chief Briggs asked, his voice containing both pride and anxiety. Are you sure you want to execute it this publicly, this dramatically? Chief, have you seen the video? McAllister spat on my badge. He pressed his knee into my back because of the color of my skin. This was not a mistake. This was the arrogance of a system, and that system needs to witness its downfall publicly. Brooks said, her voice no longer that of an agent, but a warrior. I have been ready for 20 years, Chief. McAllister represents everything that is wrong, racism disguised by a badge, and he is about to find out the woman he humiliated is his new commanding officer. Chief Briggs laughed, the sound mixed with astonishment. My God, she is about to be his judge, jury, and law enforcement official all at once. Knock their socks off, Angela. Brooks ended the call. She walked to her closet, not the navy blue suit she wore today, but the deep black federal police uniform neatly hung. On its shoulder epaulettes was the new meticulously designed senior insignia symbolizing supreme power over recruitment training and personnel discipline. She double-checked her detailed timetable. 1:30 p.m. present medical evidence and cross-examine McAllister. 1:45 p.m. create legal chaos force recess. 3 p.m. swearing in ceremony. McAllister chose his own actions. Brooks reiterated. She placed the McAllister Ryan personnel review file into a compartment of her briefcase next to a copy of the federal Constitution. I am just ensuring those choices have consequences. Angela Brooks turned off the light. She had done everything she could now. She only waited for the clock hand to reach the appointed moment of destiny. Only 15 minutes left until collapse. The lights in the hearing room turned back on. It was 2:55 p.m. The air was suffocatingly tense. The investigation board members who had seemed self-satisfied earlier now exchanged nervous glances. They knew something big was about to happen. Officer Ryan McAllister sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his arrogance had vanished, replaced by fear. Angela Brooks's declaration about the 3:00 p.m. meeting had sowed doubt into his entire 22-year narrative. His lawyer, Nolan, tried to maintain composure. Counsel, let us proceed. We cannot allow the plaintiff to run the proceedings according to her personal schedule. Angela Brooks did not respond. She only looked straight at the large screen at the end of the room. 2:57 p.m. Brooks' lawyer, whom she had quietly hired only to handle technical matters, stood up. He did not speak much, just plugged a small hard drive into the system. Counsel, the lawyer, began, his voice calm but containing absolute power after reviewing the defendant's heavily edited video evidence. We requested and received the complete Academy security camera footage from the National Security Review Office. Immediately, the large screen lit up the audience. The investigation board and McAllister held their breath. This is the unedited recording filmed from 3 different angles at the security control gate at 8:47 a.m. on September 21st, the lawyer announced. Scene 1, overhead view camera angle. The video began. 8:30 a.m. Officer Ryan McAllister was leaning against the control booth. He was smiling, holding his phone, showing he was not in a state of high security alert as claimed. Angela Brooks appeared. She stopped the car slowly, legally. McAllister's voice boomed now, fully restored without white noise. Frankly, bitch, this area is not for your kind of low-class people now. Move along. The crude racist sound echoed in the hearing room, making the investigation board members flinch. McAllister winced. Scene 2, mid-level view camera angle. Everyone witnessed Brooks calmly presenting the card. Officer Ryan McAllister snatched it, his face contorted with contempt, and then the undeniable act, he ripped the card and spat on the fragments. McAllister had sworn Brooks was the aggressor, but the video showed Brooks completely silent. She only opened the car door after the card was ripped. Scene 3. Close-up view camera angle. The audience witnessed Brooks bending down to pick up the humiliated card pieces, and then the horrifying sight, McAllister lunging forcefully, pressing his knee into her back, locking the handcuffs. The entire act of unprovoked physical violence occurred while Brooks was completely submissive. This evidence, Brooks's lawyer said, his voice full of authority, completely nullifies Officer McAllister's testimony. Miss Brooks was not aggressive. She was assaulted because of the color of her skin and Officer McAllister's prejudice. Brooks's lawyer did not stop there. He launched a direct attack on the integrity of the defendant and his lawyer. Next, we will present a side-by-side comparison, the lawyer announced. On the left is Officer McAllister's original body cam footage. On the right is the edited body cam footage that Counsel Nolan presented earlier. The screens split. Left original showed Officer Ryan McAllister aggressively arguing, followed by the scene of Brooks being assaulted and painfully handcuffed. Right edited began immediately after Brooks was handcuffed and attempting to rise. Sirs and madams, Brooks' lawyer said, emphasizing every word between the time frame of 8:30 a.m. and 8:47 a.m. of the original body cam. A section was completely cut, removing the racist and aggressive behavior. This evidence is not an administrative error. This is a deliberate act of removing incriminating evidence and falsifying evidence in a federal hearing procedure. The lawyer looked straight at Nolan. The defendant's counsel presented fabricated footage. This is not just perjury, but obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud a federal agency. Nolan went pale, his hands trembling as he fumbled for documents. McAllister buried his head. He knew he had lost. Perjury in a federal case was the end of everything he had ever had. Next, Linda Morales, an administrative employee who had worked at the academy for 27 years, was called to the witness stand. Miss Morales, did you witness the event that day? The legal counsel asked. I saw the whole thing. I saw Miss Brooks pushed down by Officer McAllister. I saw him spit. It made me sick. Morales replied, her voice filled with suppressed indignation. In your 27 years at the academy, have you ever witnessed similar behavior from Officer McAllister? Lawyer Nolan objected, but the legal counsel overruled. Allow testimony on the pattern of behavior. Morales took a deep breath, looking straight at the investigation board. Oh yes, he has been doing this all along. He calls it keeping the academy clean, but he only targets one type of person, people of color, Latinos, black people. I can tell you about a lawyer of color who was randomly checked 3 times a week about an Asian American engineering student held for looking too smart to be a good person 15 times. I reported this to superiors, but nothing ever happened. She pointed at McAllister. He is not a professional officer. He is an abuser of power covered by this system. For 22 years, we are afraid of him. Morales's testimony not only exposed McAllister, but also the complicity of the investigation board and senior officers who had ignored complaints to maintain the academy's order. Right then, the clock showed 3:00 p.m. Suddenly, the large screen which had been displaying Morales's testimony was interrupted. A deep blue color appeared, followed by the majestic FBI seal and the text National Oversight Council. A dignified white man in a neat black suit, the divisional FBI director, Director Thomas Whitaker, appeared on the screen. He stood in a luxurious conference room, behind him the American flag and the FBI flag. I apologize for the interruption, Director Whitaker said, his voice calm, but imbued with the absolute authority of the federal agency. I am aware you are conducting an internal hearing, but I have an official announcement directly and supremely relevant to these proceedings and all personnel at the National Law Enforcement Academy. Everyone froze. McAllister leaned back, sweat pouring down his face. Director Whitaker looked directly into the camera, his gaze piercing the screen, seemingly looking straight at McAllister. Today at 3:00 p.m. we are officially conducting the swearing-in ceremony for the Chief of the National Recruitment and Training Review Board. He turned to the side, smiling. This is a new position granted full authority to oversee change and enforce discipline across all policy and personnel of the Academy. And it is my honor to announce that the holder of this position is... He paused, looking directly into the hearing room. Senior Agent Angela Denise Brooks. The entire hearing room erupted in astonishment. The investigation board members looked at each other, their expressions turning from surprise to horror. Chief of the National Recruitment and Training Review Board, that was not just a title, that was the person with the power to shut down the entire academy if necessary. McAllister gaped. He had assaulted, spat on, and pressed his knee onto his new Supreme Commanding Officer. Angela Brooks stood up, no longer the plaintiff in a navy blue suit. She removed her outer jacket. Underneath was the deep black federal police uniform, perfectly tailored. On her shoulder, the gleaming senior insignia symbolizing the highest authority in the Academy's personnel system. Brooks walked to the center of the room, not turning back to look at the screen where Director Whitaker was still smiling. She did not need external confirmation. The authority was here in her uniform and insignia. Counsel Brooks said, her voice now carrying a new weight. Not testimony, but an executive order. This hearing is no longer a civil lawsuit. It is a formal administrative interrogation overseen by the federal police, conducted with a subordinate officer currently under suspension. Brooks did not need to take the however Academy records show 21 formal complaints of discrimination and abuse of authority. Of those, 14 were unjustly dismissed. Brooks began reading each incident, omitting no detail. March 2015. Dr. Miguel Alvarez, a Latino surgeon, was detained for 4 hours for looking out of place in this area. August 2021. Veteran Leonard Price, African American, had his military ID spat on because he was deemed too arrogant. McAllister winced. These were not general accusations. These were buried secrets he thought were gone forever. Your pattern of abuse, Brooks continued, has cost the city a total of $3.2 million in out-of-court civil lawsuit settlements. Were you aware of this figure, Officer McAllister? I did not know, McAllister stammered. Of course you did not know. Your superiors deliberately concealed it. Officer McAllister, Brooks held up an email printout. This is an internal email from your former superior, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Lang, stating, as long as the gate is clean, let Ryan do it his way. This cover-up ends now. Brooks looked straight at McAllister, her gaze undeniable judgment. She had proven him to be a liar, a falsifier of evidence, and a racist tolerated by systemic complicity. Officer Ryan McAllister, Oversight Chief. Brooks said, her voice echoing, you have gravely violated Federal Police Conduct Rule 3.11, Civil Rights Violation Rule 4.09, and committed perjury before the investigation board. She placed the file down, an act of finality. Furthermore, by assaulting a federal official at a checkpoint, you have demonstrated a lack of judgment and a disrespect for the law. You are not just a single incident, you are a moral and financial burden to the police department. Brooks concluded, effective immediately. Under the authority of the Chief of the National Recruitment and Training Review Board, your employment with the police department is terminated for inappropriate conduct and civil rights violations. The entire hearing room held its breath. McAllister's 22-year career was over. His badge, pension, and authority were stripped away with a single sentence from the very woman he had spat upon. McAllister collapsed onto the table, his face buried in his perfectly pressed uniform. He was not crying for his career, but for the shattering of the world he had believed would always protect him. Oversight Chief Angela Brooks did not flinch. Justice had been served. Brooks turned to the investigation board and those present, no longer to submit evidence but to declare a precedent. Sirs and madams, Brooks said, her voice not loud but carrying the weight of years of fighting for the truth. We now have enough evidence not just to fire Officer McAllister, but to expose the culture that tolerated him. Ryan McAllister believed his badge, his 22 years of service, and the color of his skin placed him above the law. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over everyone. We witnessed arrogance turned into violence. We witnessed racism disguised as security protocol, and we witnessed senior officers covering up that behavior to maintain the academy's appearance. Brooks paused, looking directly at the investigation board members who had previously ignored her complaints. Under the pressure of the undeniable video evidence and Brooks's new identity, the investigation board rendered a swift verdict based on the evidence presented, including academy surveillance video and the defendant's full personnel record. The legal counsel announced, his voice tense. The investigation board concludes Officer Ryan McAllister is liable for battery violating federal civil rights and intentional falsification of evidence. The investigation board. McAllister lifted his head, his face stunned. Lawyer Nolan was also surprised. Instead, Brooks continued, I request that the entire sum of $600,000 be used to establish a fund. This fund will finance the mandatory psychological and unconscious bias training program for all current trainees and officers of the National Law Enforcement Academy. She looked straight at the investigation board. The goal is not enrichment. The goal is rectification. We must re-educate the law enforcement force from the most fundamental level. I want McAllister's misconduct to fund the systemic change he always sought to resist. The legal counsel nodded. Request approved. The compensation amount will be converted into the Brooks-McAllister Police Reform Fund immediately. Following the verdict, federal marshals who had been standing packed at the back door entered. Officer Ryan McAllister, a federal marshal, said, his voice decisive. You are under arrest for perjury, obstruction of justice, and assaulting a federal officer. Please stand up and present your hands. McAllister no longer resisted. He was a defeated man. He was led away in handcuffs, walking out of the room he had once dominated. He entered the academy as an officer and left as a convicted criminal. His 22-year career pension and honor completely collapsed. The room fell silent. Justice had been served perfectly, completely, publicly, and irreversibly. 9 months later, the change at the National Law Enforcement Academy was incredible. Ryan McAllister was serving a federal prison sentence. For obstruction of justice, no longer in a pressed uniform, he wore prison fatigues, and the only authority he held was folding laundry in the prison's washroom. His wife had filed for divorce, and his family moved away, unable to bear the public humiliation. Under the leadership of Oversight Chief Angela Brooks, the academy underwent a radical overhaul. The rate of complaints about abuse of power and racism at the academy gate dropped by 80%. The mandatory psychological evaluation and unconscious bias training program, funded by McAllister's compensation, became a model copied by police departments nationwide. 3 senior officers who had covered for McAllister were fired and were facing internal investigation for complicity. Brooks transformed her position into a mechanism for real change, eliminating the walls of silence and replacing them with public accountability. Angela Brooks stood before a class of newly graduated police trainees, the most diverse class in the academy's history. She wore her uniform and senior insignia. You are about to bear this badge, Brooks said, her voice inspiring and strong. It represents public trust and the supreme authority of the law, but remember this, the badge grants you the right to serve, not the right to dominate. Do not let your unconscious bias turn you into abusers of power. We will oversee you not to find fault, but to ensure you become the law enforcers this country deserves. She told the story of Officer Ryan McAllister not to defame but to serve as an example of the danger of arrogance. Never believe your personal record is spotless. Every day you must earn this badge. Be law enforcers not just with strength, but with integrity. The story concluded, the scene transitioning to Brooks leaving the academy now with the absolute respect of every staff member. She got into her old sedan, needing no escort, making no display. Narration concludes Angela Brooks's journey from humiliated victim to supreme authority chief is a reminder that true power does not come from a gun or a badge, but from integrity and courage. McAllister assaulted a woman of color he thought was weak. He was tragically wrong, and because of his arrogance, a system was forced to change. If this story of irreversible justice has inspired you, share it now, comment below. Tell us what you would do if you had the power to change an unjust system. Subscribe to our channel because we believe that justice always wins. Never let anyone, no matter what badge they wear, make you feel like you do not belong where you have every right to stand. Justice was served, but the fight is never over.